Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where light wasn't flicked on with a tap or summoned by voice, but carefully coaxed from humble beginnings. You probably never paused to think about the very essence of light in medieval villages, how the simplest glow came from creatures long forgotten, or the thick, greasy remnants of animals you'd rather not imagine. It's a faint, lingering image you might overlook, but once noticed, you can't unsee the slow, patient art of turning fat and wax into fragile flames that kept homes from total darkness. This story doesn't shout like the grand battles or king's triumphs. It hides in soot-stained corners, in the slow drip of melted wax and the careful harvest of beeswax from wild hives perched precariously on cliffs or in dense forests. And a cheeky reality check before you get too cozy, you probably wouldn't survive a day in their shoes, juggling boiling fats and dodging angry bees without modern safety gear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who's joining me from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself at the very beginning of medieval candle making, a craft born out of necessity and stubborn human will to push back the overwhelming darkness of night. The light sources we take for granted today were barely dreamt of. Torches and open fires were the norm, but they came with their own risks, smoke, sparks, and wildly fluctuating brightness. Candles, slow burning and steady, were an innovation that began humbly, rooted in what nature offered, and human ingenuity could wring from it. Before the days of commercial suppliers or neatly packaged beeswax bricks, medieval candle makers scavenged raw materials from the environment. The most common and accessible substance was animal fat, often called tallow. Tallow came from the rendered fats of sheep, cattle, pigs, and sometimes even horses. The process was crude after butchering animals for meat. Workers saved the leftover fatty scraps, which would later be boiled down to separate the usable fat from the rest of the carcass. This tallow was cheap and plentiful, but it was far from perfect. It emitted a strong, unpleasant odor when burned, and the resulting candles were prone to smoking and dripping. Yet, for many peasants and townsfolk, tallow candles were the only affordable option to light their homes after sunset. The alternative was beeswax, a far more precious and coveted resource. Beeswax came from the honeycomb structures built by bees deep in forests, cliffs, or even hollowed-out trees near villages. Harvesting beeswax was an ordeal on its own. You had to locate wild hives, which were often nestled in treacherous spots that required balancing on rickety ladders or climbing trees with minimal safety. The bees were, unsurprisingly, aggressive defenders of their homes, and getting too close meant risking painful stings. Once the honeycomb was extracted, it had to be carefully melted to separate the wax from the honey and impurities. Beeswax produced candles that burned brighter, cleaner, and with a subtle, sweet aroma, making it the preferred choice of churches, wealthy households, and nobility. Historians still argue whether early candle makers preferred beeswax or tallow out of necessity or cultural preference. Some evidence suggests that rural areas depended heavily on tallow due to its availability, while urban centers and religious institutions invested more in beeswax candles, treating them as both light sources and symbols of purity. Setting up a candle-making workshop was simple but demanding. Many makers operated from small lean-tos or rooms adjacent to their homes, often located along busy village alleys or market streets. These workshops had to be close enough to the source of raw materials farms for animal fats or forests for beeswax, and also accessible for customers or merchants. The interiors were sparse, dominated by large cauldrons or iron kettles used to melt fats, racks for drying dip candles, and tables scattered with tools. Light inside was dim, ironically, so you can imagine the candle makers working by natural daylight or even by a small tallow candle, carefully avoiding accidents in a place filled with hot liquids and flammable substances. The smell inside was a defining feature. Imagine a thick, almost suffocating blend of animal grease, burning fat, and the faint, honeyed sweetness from wax. Makers often mixed herbs and spices into their wax or tallow, not just for fragrance, but also in the hope of masking the less pleasant odors or to imbue the candles with supposed protective qualities. Rosemary, lavender, and even rosemary-infused oils found their way into the mix, though the effectiveness was more psychological than chemical. Your hands might smell like rancid fat hours after you leave the workshop. The tools were mostly simple wooden frames to hold wicks, ladles for pouring hot fat, molds made from wood or metal for shaped candles, and knives for trimming excess wax. The repetitive motion of dipping a wick into molten tallow or beeswax, then drying it to build layer after layer of wax, was almost meditative. Makers timed each dip and drying period carefully. Too fast, and the layers would crack or drip unevenly. Too slow, and production slowed to a crawl. Curiously, some makers believe that adding bits of dried herbs or even animal dung to the fat mixture improved candle burning or scent. While modern chemistry would scoff, these odd practices reflect the folk wisdom and superstition woven into the craft. Whether these additives had any real benefit is unclear, but they certainly add color to the story of medieval candle making. Candles weren't just tools for light, they were objects wrapped in social and religious significance. The soft, flickering glow had associations with the divine, the mystical, and the protective. Churches demanded thick beeswax candles for their long nocturnal services, as the flame symbolized the presence of God and the fight against spiritual darkness. Wealthy households boasted candles of superior quality, while common folk settled for tallow varieties that smoked and dripped, but still chased the dark from their homes. You might chuckle at the simplicity of their tools and materials, but candle making was a delicate balance of chemistry, timing, and manual skill. Too hot a fire, and you spoiled a batch of wax. Too cold, and the fat wouldn't melt evenly. The quality of your raw materials dictated the final product's shine and burn time, influencing your reputation and livelihood. Even the wick's material, often linen or hemp, had to be chosen carefully to control the candle's flame and soot production. The demand for candles was steady but modest. Unlike today, where lighting is taken for granted, medieval nights were long, and the hours after sunset were sparse with illumination. Many families used a single candle per evening, rationing light carefully to conserve precious wax and fat. The act of lighting a candle was almost ceremonial, marking the transition from day to night. So, as you imagine the flickering glow of a crude tallow candle burning through a cold, drafty medieval home, remember this slow, patient process. The candlemakers harvested their raw materials from nature's bounty and refuse, labored in smelly, dim workshops, and kept the dark at bay for those without a hearthfire's steady glow. This humble craft was both art and survival, hidden in plain sight, and carried on by skilled hands who made light from fat and wax, one dip at a time. You follow the candlemaker deeper into the wilds, where the precious beeswax begins its journey. Harvesting beeswax wasn't just a matter of strolling into a meadow and plucking honeycomb like some sweet souvenir. It was a dangerous, sticky, and often painful ordeal that required bravery, skill, and a touch of recklessness. The wild bee colonies nested in remote places, hollow trees deep in forests, rocky crevices on cliffs, or even inside the wooden beams of abandoned buildings. You can almost hear the buzzing growing louder as you approach a hive, thick with the hum of thousands of vigilant defenders. Bees don't take kindly to intruders, and in those days, you had little more than a rudimentary smoke source, often just damp straw or rotten wood to pacify the angry swarm. Imagine balancing precariously on a shaky ladder, or wedging yourself into a narrow tree cavity, armed with a simple knife or hooked tool to pry away the honeycomb. The bees would swarm aggressively, stinging relentlessly as you worked. Protective clothing was non-existent, so every sting was a sharp, burning reminder of the stakes. It was a delicate balance. Harvest too little, and you risked angering the bees and damaging the colony. Harvest too much, and the colony could die off, leaving no future wax or honey. Most bee colonies were wild, and beekeeping as a controlled practice was still in early development, so candlemakers often relied on these risky raids to gather beeswax. The honeycomb itself was a marvel of natural engineering. Thin hexagonal cells crafted from pure beeswax, storing honey and brood. After extraction, the honey was usually drained or eaten quickly, while the wax was collected and prepared for candle making. The raw comb was dirty, filled with bits of honey, bee parts, and tree debris, so it had to be carefully melted down in water baths to separate and purify the wax. This process took hours, with makers skimming off impurities and pressing the softened wax into blocks or sheets. Some makers guarded their wax sources fiercely, knowing that a good hive could supply enough beeswax to make candles for months. Others formed early beekeeping groups, cultivating hives in wooden skeps or clay pots placed near their homes. But this practice was still primitive, and wild hive hunting remained the primary method for many. Folklore surrounded bees and their wax, and beeswax was often seen as a symbol of purity and protection, and candles made from it were used in rituals, weddings, and funerals. A popular belief was that beeswax candles burned cleaner because bees gathered nectar from flowers blessed by nature itself. Some candle makers claimed that candles made from beeswax were less likely to attract evil spirits, a comforting thought on dark nights. Historians still argue whether the dangerous practice of wild hive harvesting contributed to early beekeeping innovations. Some suggest that necessity drove makers to domesticate bees and develop apiaries, while others believe that wild honey hunting and candle making remained largely separate traditions for centuries. The seasonality of beeswax collection added another layer of complexity. Harvesting was only possible during warm months when bees were active and hives were full. During the cold winters, wax stocks had to last, forcing candle makers to ration supplies or supplement with cheaper tallow candles. This seasonal scarcity made beeswax candles a luxury in many villages. Processing beeswax was both art and labor. Once melted and purified, it had to be molded or dipped carefully to produce candles that burned evenly. Beeswax's melting point was higher than tallow's, which made working it a bit trickier. Makers often needed large cauldrons and plenty of water for cooling the molten wax. The wax was often mixed with a small amount of tallow or other fats to adjust burning properties and reduce cost. But purists frowned on this practice. A quirky tidbit, some candle makers believed that adding small amounts of crushed herbs or flower petals to melted beeswax improved the scent and burning quality. Rosemary and lavender were popular choices, though others experimented with more exotic ingredients like frankincense or myrrh, especially when making candles for churches or wealthy patrons. The buzzing soundtrack of the forest, the sticky honeycomb, and the sting of bees are vivid sensory details you can almost feel as you step into the candlemaker's world. It was a dangerous, delicate dance between man and nature, where a wrong move meant lost harvest or a painful swarm attack. The value of beeswax candles, though, made every risk worthwhile for those who relied on light to guide their way through long nights. Meanwhile, the honey from the harvested comb wasn't wasted. It was a valuable sweetener and preservative, essential in medieval kitchens and medicine chests. The interplay between honey and wax collection made wild hive harvesting a dual-purpose enterprise. The honey was often shared among villagers, sold in markets, or stored for winter months. Sometimes honey was even used to ferment mead, an alcoholic drink enjoyed by many. The role of the bees extended beyond candles and honey. Their pollination efforts kept crops healthy, sustaining the very agricultural societies that depended on tallow and wax for light. It's an intricate web of life and labor, where the candlemaker was both beneficiary and risk-taker in a broader ecological cycle. Not all wax came from wild hives, of course. In some regions, monks and monasteries pioneered early beekeeping methods, keeping hives in enclosed gardens and harvesting wax for sacred uses. These monastic apiaries were better managed, producing higher quality wax and providing a more reliable supply. Their candles lit the long prayers and vigils of religious life, casting shadows on stone walls as monks chanted through the night. In villages without access to such luxuries, candlemakers made do with what they could find. Beeswax was the gold standard, but for many, tallow was the daily reality. The contrast between the two materials underscored the social and economic divides of the time. As you imagine yourself clutching a wooden basket heavy with wax and honeycomb, swatting away bees and tasting the wild sweetness lingering on your lips, you glimpsed the precarious existence of the medieval candlemaker. It was a life balanced on the edge of pain and reward, darkness and light, survival and ritual. This vivid, sticky world of honey hunters and wax gatherers shaped the very glow that lit countless medieval nights. Without their labor, those flickering flames that chased back shadows would never have existed. You step into the smoky heart of the candlemaker's workshop, where the next crucial step begins rendering animal fats into usable tallow. This process was messy, hot, and more than a little dangerous. Unlike beeswax, which came naturally formed from the bees, tallow had to be painstakingly separated from raw animal scraps left over after butchering. The leftover fatty tissues, suet, and trimmings from cattle, sheep, pigs, and sometimes horses were collected and boiled in large iron cauldrons suspended over open fires. The goal was to melt the fat, allowing it to separate from the blood, connective tissue, and other impurities that were useless or harmful for candle making. The process was both an art and a science, reliant on precise heat control and timing. Though science was more trial and error than anything else, you can almost feel the heat radiating off the cauldron, smell the thick, acrid aroma of boiling fat mixing with smoke from the firewood. The bubbling liquid looked viscous and dangerous, ready to scald the skin if spilled. Every step demanded caution. A slip could lead to burns or an uncontrollable fire. The workshop was often cramped, poorly ventilated, and full of slippery floors covered in grease, making every movement a risk. As the fat melted, the maker skimmed off the floating impurities, bits of meat, sinew, and occasionally, tiny animal hairs. Once the liquid was clear and free of debris, it was poured into shallow molds or buckets to cool and solidify into the pale, waxy blocks known as tallow. This raw tallow was then ready to be melted again for candle making, sometimes mixed with other ingredients to improve burning qualities or scent. The smell was unforgettable. Some described it as a mix of rotten cheese, burnt popcorn, and a faint hint of old meat. No one would call it pleasant, but it was a smell synonymous with the warmth and light the tallow would provide after hours of careful crafting. To many, it was a smell of survival. A quirky and less-known detail was that some candle makers tried to improve the tallow's quality by adding animal dung. Yes, you read that right. While it sounds revolting today, the practice was believed to reduce smoke and unpleasant odor during burning. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or limited to a few desperate workshops, but it highlights the desperation and experimentation baked into medieval candle production. Of course, adding dung created its own risks, including health hazards and further foul smells. Once the tallow cooled and hardened, it was cut into manageable chunks and stored for later use. During winter months, storage was tricky. Cold temperatures hardened the fat into brittle blocks, while summer heat risked melting and spoiling the supply. Candle makers had to plan their stock carefully, balancing production with seasonal conditions. The quality of tallow varied widely, depending on the animal source and the rendering process. For example, sheep tallow tended to burn brighter but softer, while beef tallow was harder but produced more smoke. Pig's fat was sometimes avoided for candles due to its distinct smell and burning properties, but it was used out of necessity in poorer communities. Makers often mixed fats to achieve a compromise in quality. Working with tallow required more than just melting and molding. Makers had to understand how temperature affected the fat's behavior. Too high a heat could scorch the fat, darkening the candle and making it brittle or crumbly. Too low, and the fat wouldn't melt thoroughly, resulting in lumpy candles that burned unevenly. The flickering flames of these imperfect candles were a constant reminder of the maker's skill or lack thereof. Another practical challenge was the wick. Linen or hemp fibers were common wick materials, but they had to be prepared carefully. A wick that was too thick would smolder and smoke, while one too thin would burn out quickly. Makers sometimes dipped wicks in salt water or brine to stiffen them and control burn rate, a trick passed down through generations. You might smile at the slow, almost primitive nature of this work, but candle making was a vital profession in medieval life. Every light in a cottage or chapel came from fat rendered by someone who had spent hours boiling, skimming, and molding tallow. The stakes were high because poor quality candles meant darkness, danger, and discomfort after sunset. Guilds, where they existed, often set minimum standards for tallow quality, demanding candles be made from clean, properly rendered fat. They inspected workshops and punished those who sold substandard candles. Such regulations, however, were hard to enforce in rural areas, where necessity trumped quality. The rendering process also created valuable byproducts. The leftover solid bits after boiling, called grease cake or cracklings, were sometimes used as animal feed or fertilizer. Nothing was wasted in the medieval economy. Every bit of material had a purpose. You might chuckle at how far candle making was from the sleek factories of today. There were no thermostats or quality control labs, just the maker's eyes, hands, and nose guiding every batch. The physical labor was exhausting, especially during cold months when long nights increased demand, forcing makers to work late into darkness under the very light they were producing. The social status of candle makers was modest. They were craftsmen and tradespeople, respected for their skill but often struggling financially. Their workshops were rarely grand or clean, and they faced the constant risk of fire workshops filled with hot fats and open flames, where tinderboxes waiting for a spark. This constant threat of fire was a grim reality. Accidental blazes could destroy entire workshops and nearby homes. Firefighting methods were rudimentary, mostly relying on buckets of water or sand. Insurance was unheard of, and many makers lived in fear of losing their livelihood to a stray ember. In spite of these hardships, candle making was an enduring craft, passed down through families and communities. The knowledge of rendering fats, preparing wicks, and molding candles formed the backbone of the medieval illumination economy. Without tallow rendering, countless homes would have been plunged into total darkness every night. So as you imagine the smoky, heat-filled workshop with vats of boiling fat and skimming tools, remember the careful hands that transformed raw animal remains into flickering lights. This alchemy of fat and fire was an unglamorous but essential act that shaped medieval nights. You step outside the smoky confines of the workshop and into the village alley, where the candlemaker's world expands beyond just melting and molding fat and wax. The basic workshop setup was as humble as the materials it worked with, often a small room or lean-to, with little more than the essentials. Squeezed between neighboring homes or nestled along bustling market streets, these workshops were places of hard work and quiet ritual, barely protected from the elements, and full of the constant sense of smoke, melting fat, and beeswax mingled with the aromas of herbs, sometimes added to mask the stronger odors. You can almost feel the rough stone walls and uneven dirt floor underfoot as you observe the scene, the air thick with heat and anticipation of the next batch of candles. Medieval candlemakers often operated with what we would now call minimalist equipment. There was no luxury of temperature-controlled rooms or mechanized tools. Instead, everything hinged on well-worn wooden tables, rickety drying racks, large iron cauldrons, and simple molds carved or hammered from wood and metal. The entire operation was a hands-on process requiring physical strength, patience, and acute attention to detail. Despite their humble settings, these workshops were the lifeblood of their communities, providing the essential light that would allow families to extend their day past sunset. The workshop's placement within the village was strategic. Proximity to the raw materials was key, close enough to farms to obtain animal fats, near forests for access to wild beeswax, and often adjacent to market squares to facilitate sales. Yet this closeness to the center of village life brought challenges. Smoke and smells were constant complaints from neighbors, and the risk of fire was always present, especially in tightly packed wooden villages. You can imagine the occasional flare-ups that had to be doused quickly before they spread to adjoining homes. Inside, the workspace was organized with careful simplicity. Large cauldrons or kettles hung over open hearths, or iron stoves where fats and waxes melted slowly. Wooden racks and poles stood ready for dipping wicks repeatedly, and tables were cluttered with tools, knives for trimming candles, molds for shaping, and bundles of prepared wicks. These workshops were often cluttered and messy, but every tool had its place and purpose, reflecting years of accumulated knowledge and craft. Lighting inside the workshop itself was an ironic challenge. During the day, natural light filtered through small windows or open doors. But on gloomy days or early mornings, the room could be dim and shadowy, forcing makers to rely on tallow candles or small oil lamps to continue their work. This created a kind of loop where candles were both the product and the light source for their creation. The working conditions were tough. The heat from fires and molten fats could be stifling, especially in summer months. In winter, drafts and cold air chilled exposed skin, making the work uncomfortable. The floor was often greasy and slippery, and the risk of accidents was ever present. Despite this, makers labored for long hours, often beginning before dawn and continuing past dusk. Responding to the needs of their customers and the pressures of supply, you can almost hear the sounds of the workshop, the bubbling of fats and cauldrons, the rhythmic dipping of wicks, the soft scraping of knives, and the occasional cough or grunt from the worker battling fumes and fatigue. Outside, the chatter of villagers passing by mingled with the occasional clatter of carts or livestock. A quirky yet telling detail about these workshops was the occasional use of herbs and spices in the wax mixtures. Makers sometimes scattered rosemary, lavender, or even bits of dried flowers near their workstations, believing that these additions improved the scent of the candles, or even offered protection against malevolent spirits. While these beliefs may seem quaint now, they reveal a world where craft and superstition were intertwined, and every candle carried not just light but also hope and ritual. Historians still debate the degree to which these workshops were standardized or varied wildly from village to village. Some evidence suggests that in larger towns, candle makers formed guilds or cooperatives, sharing knowledge and setting quality standards. In contrast, rural workshops might have been solitary affairs, with each maker developing idiosyncratic techniques passed down through family lines. The workshops were also social spaces, albeit modest ones. Apprentices and journeymen worked alongside masters, learning the trade through hands-on experience. The relationship between master and apprentice was strict, but vital for preserving the craft. Apprentices often started young and endured years of labor before mastering the subtle techniques that separated a good candle from a poor one. Outside the workshop, the market scene was vibrant. Candle makers displayed their products on wooden stalls or carried baskets through crowded streets. Sales could be brisk or slow, depending on the season and local demand. You might catch a glimpse of merchants bartering for candles in exchange for food, cloth, or tools, reflecting a barter economy that still dominated many medieval communities. The workshops were never pristine. The floors bore stains from spilled wax and tallow. Tools were coated in grime, and the walls sometimes bore scorch marks from past fires. Despite their roughness, these spaces held a quiet dignity, a testament to human ingenuity and the everyday battle against darkness. As you imagine stepping through the threshold of such a workshop, the sensory details, heat, smell, sound, and texture create a vivid portrait of a craft that was as demanding as it was essential. This was a world where light was hard-won, sweat earned, and precious beyond measure. Remember, these candlemaker workshops were not just about making objects. They were about sustaining community life, enabling evening conversations, prayers, and rest. Without their glow, medieval nights would have been far darker, colder, and lonelier. Your eyes adjust to the cluttered space filled with the tools of the candlemaker's trade, each one worn from years of use and indispensable to the delicate craft. The essential tools were surprisingly simple, but required skillful handling and intimate knowledge of materials. A tallow ladle, often a wooden scoop or a tin cup with a long handle, was used to pour molten fat into molds or over wicks. The ladle had to withstand the searing heat and allow precise control to avoid spills that could cause dangerous flare-ups. Dipping frames, often made of wood or iron, held multiple wicks, stretched taut and ready for the rhythmic dipping process that built candle layers. These frames could be handheld or set up on racks to allow simultaneous work on dozens of candles, an early form of batch production. Knives and scrapers were vital for trimming excess wax and smoothing uneven surfaces after drying. Since candles were handmade, imperfections like drips, bumps, or uneven diameters were common, and finishing tools helped standardize the final product to meet buyers' expectations. You can picture the maker hunched over a rough-hewn table, carefully shaving off flaws to create a smooth, uniform candle. Wick preparation tools also played a crucial role. Wicks, usually made from twisted linen or hemp fibers, had to be combed and cut to exact lengths to ensure proper burning. Some makers used simple wooden combs or small scissors to manage the fibers, sometimes treating the wicks with brine or salt solutions to stiffen them and regulate flame size. This seemingly small step had a significant impact on candle performance, controlling smoke and burn time. Molds were another essential tool that transformed candle making from purely dipping into a more controlled shaping process. Early molds were crafted from carved wood or thin sheets of metal like tin or lead, often hinged or tied with cords to release the hardened candle. These molds produced candles with uniform shapes, cylindrical, square, or even decorative forms which were popular for religious ceremonies or wealthier households. Wooden molds required careful maintenance to prevent warping and ensure tight seals to avoid wax leakage. Mold making was a skilled craft in itself, sometimes handled by specialists who supplied candle makers. The workshop also held vessels for melting and storing raw materials, large iron cauldrons for heating tallow or beeswax, wooden tubs for cooling, and small pots for mixing scented oils or dyes. Handling hot wax required heat-resistant gloves or thick cloths, though these were rudimentary and offered limited protection. Makers often developed calloused hands and scars from years of working with hot, sticky substances. You might find a simple scale or balance used to measure materials, especially when mixing different fats or adding scents. Accuracy was important to maintain quality, though precise measurement tools were rare and often homemade. The whole process relied heavily on experience, memory, and sensory judgment, knowing by sight and feel when wax had reached the right temperature or when a batch was pure enough for use. Among the more unusual tools were wooden paddles or spoons used to stir melting fats and waxes, ensuring even heating and preventing scorching. These paddles had to be sturdy and resistant to heat and grease, often passed down through generations. The sensory experience of these tools was tactile and intimate. You can almost feel the smoothness of a polished wooden dipping frame or the roughness of a hand-carved mold, the weight of a metal ladle hot with molten wax, the stickiness of wax residue clinging to fingers, and the faint scent of herbs mixed into the wax all combined into a rich, multi-sensory environment. A quirky but telling detail is that some candle makers customized their tools with simple carvings or marks, perhaps as personal signatures or to identify ownership in shared workshops. These marks sometimes took the form of simple initials, small symbols, or even protective charms intended to ward off accidents and bad luck. Historians still debate the extent to which candle makers innovated their tools or borrowed from other crafts. Some suggest that blacksmiths, coopers, and woodworkers often collaborated, providing metal molds, hooks, and frames, blurring the lines between trades. This network of artisanal cooperation was vital to sustaining the craft and adapting tools to local needs. It's also fascinating to note that as demand for candles grew in towns and cities, makers began to experiment with more efficient tools and setups. Some workshops introduced wheeled carts equipped with dipping racks, allowing candle makers to produce and sell their wares directly on the street. This mobile workshop concept foreshadowed later market innovations. The tools were more than just instruments. They were extensions of the maker's hands, each one telling a story of countless hours spent shaping the fragile dance between wax and flame. Without these simple but essential implements, the slow, steady light of medieval nights would have been impossible. As you imagine the maker's workshop, cluttered with ladles, molds, dipping frames, and knives, you realize that each object holds a legacy of craft, tradition, and survival. The tools were humble but vital, bridging raw nature and human need, forging light from the darkness one candle at a time. You breathe in the dense air of the candlemaker's workshop, where the mingling scents of burning tallow and beeswax mingle awkwardly with the fragrant hopes of herbs and spices, those curious additives that makers sometimes blended into their waxes. Masking the inevitable odor of animal fats was a daily challenge, and candle makers often resorted to infusing their candles with pleasant aromas to counterbalance the pungency. Rosemary, lavender, and sage were popular choices, their dried leaves crushed and stirred into molten wax or sprinkled onto molds. These scents not only improved the candle's smell, but also served a quasi-medicinal or magical purpose. Many believed that such herbs offered protection against illness or evil spirits lurking in the dark. The mixing of scent and flame became an intimate act, where light and smell worked together to comfort and protect the household. Imagine watching a candlemaker stirring crushed herbs into a bubbling vat of molten tallow, the smoke carrying faint notes of pine and lavender through the workshop. It's a sensory tapestry, harsh and gentle, practical and superstitious all at once. Makers also experimented with fragrant oils, rose, cinnamon, and even exotic spices imported along trade routes. These were luxury additions, often reserved for the wealthy clients or religious institutions, where scented candles were as much about status and ritual as illumination. You might chuckle at the odd and sometimes unproven remedies tried by candlemakers to improve their products. Some believe that dipping candles in a solution made from crushed dried flowers or baking the finished candles with aromatic resins enhanced their burn and scent longevity. Others added powdered chalk or clay to reduce smoke, though such additives sometimes compromise the candle's structural integrity. These experimental touches speak to the craft's blend of art, science, and folk wisdom. Historians still debate the true effectiveness of these aromatic additions and whether they were widespread or limited to particular regions and social classes. Some suggest that the scented candles of medieval cathedrals inspired common makers to imitate the practice, striving for candles that not only lit a room but filled it with soothing smells. The aroma of a candle was more than a sensory delight. It had social and symbolic importance. Scented candles were used in religious ceremonies to signify purity, sanctity, and divine presence. In homes, pleasant-smelling candles masked the odors of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and livestock common in medieval dwellings. The contrast between the foulness of tallow and the sweetness of herbs created a kind of olfactory camouflage, disguising the harsh realities of a daily life. The choice of scent also reflected local availability and cultural preferences. Mediterranean regions favored rosemary and citrus oils, while northern areas leaned toward pine and fir resins. Trade brought in rare spices like cinnamon and cloves, prized not only for their aroma but also for their association with wealth and exoticism. Incorporating these spices into candles elevated their status and market price. The candlemakers' mixing techniques varied. Some added herbs directly to the molten wax, while others wrapped herbs in cloth and dipped candles through these sachets. Occasionally, dried flowers were embedded in the candle's exterior, creating decorative effects that delighted customers. These floral candles were especially popular during festivals and religious holidays, symbolizing rebirth and light triumphing over darkness. You might find it amusing that some makers believed the scent of certain herbs helped prevent the spread of disease. Lavender and rosemary, long associated with antiseptic properties, were thought to purify the air when burned. In a world without germ theory, such beliefs offered psychological comfort amid plagues and sickness. Candles infused with scent also played a role in medieval superstition. Burning rosemary or sage candles on particular nights was believed to ward off witches or evil spirits. Some families kept scented candles on windowsills or doorways as protective talismans. The flame and fragrance together formed a sensory shield against unseen dangers lurking beyond the hearth's glow. The use of scent extended into the business side of candle making. Makers often tailored their products to customer preferences, mixing scents for weddings, funerals, or feast days. A bride's candle might smell of sweet rose, while a candle for a funeral mass could be unscented or lightly spiced with frankincense. This customization reflected the candlemaker's sensitivity to social rituals and client needs. Beyond scent, makers also added color to their candles, although this was less common due to the expense of dyes. Natural pigments from plants, minerals, or insects such as saffron for yellow or cochineal for red were sometimes blended into beeswax candles for decorative or symbolic reasons. Colored candles were popular in churches and at festivals, adding a visual dimension to their spiritual and social significance. The entire practice of scenting and coloring candles illustrates the medieval candlemaker's role, not just as a craftsman, but as a cultural artisan, shaping objects that carried meaning beyond their functional purpose. Each candle told a story of light, smell, and human belief woven together. So, as you imagine the flickering glow of a lavender-scented beeswax candle burning in a dim medieval chamber, consider the centuries of knowledge, experimentation, and ritual that created that humble flame. The smell was a silent companion to the light, filling the darkness with comfort, hope, and a touch of magic. You find yourself drawn into the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the candle-dipping ritual, where the maker's hands move with practiced precision, dipping a wick repeatedly into a vat of molten wax or tallow. This was the core technique of candle making for centuries, a repetitive dance that transformed a simple string into a sturdy candle, layer by layer. Each dip added a thin coat of wax, and the drying period between dips allowed the layer to harden just enough to hold the next. You can almost hear the soft, steady splash as the wick enters and leaves the hot liquid, and the faint hiss of moisture evaporating as it dries. This process demanded patience and skill. Dip too quickly, and the wax wouldn't adhere properly. causing weak spots, dip too slowly, and production would grind to a halt. The dipping frames were often simple wooden racks or metal loops holding several wicks taut. These frames allowed candle makers to work on multiple candles at once, increasing efficiency. The size and number of wicks on a frame varied depending on demand and workspace. It's easy to picture the maker's concentrated face, eyes flicking between each candle, watching for drips, uneven coatings, or sagging. The physical effort was considerable. Dipping frames full of heavy, wet candles required strength and care to avoid splashing hot wax. The drying stage was equally crucial. Candles were hung or placed on racks in cool, draft-free areas where layers could solidify without cracking. Too much wind or uneven temperatures could cause the wax to cool improperly, leading to brittle or misshapen candles. Some makers used slow air drying, while others placed candles near fires or warm stones to speed the process, risking deformation. The tactile feedback was vital. Experienced makers learned to sense the right thickness by the candle's weight and feel, often cutting test pieces to check burn times and quality. The balance between durability and burn efficiency was a delicate one. Too thin, and the candle burned out quickly. Too thick, and it wasted precious wax. Dipping candles had limitations, especially for creating large or ornate candles. For these, makers turned to molds, but the dipping method remained dominant for everyday candles, especially tallow varieties. The repetitive nature of dipping also meant that candle making was labor-intensive and time-consuming, with a single candle requiring dozens of dips and several hours to complete. Interestingly, some makers developed regional or family-specific dipping techniques. For instance, in some areas, makers incorporated cooling dips in water between wax dips to harden layers faster, a technique that produced smoother, glossier candles. In others, they added scented oils in the final dips, layering fragrance directly onto the candle's surface. Historians still debate the origins of dipping frames and how early makers organized their workshops. Some suggest that dipping racks evolved from simple sticks or branches used to hold wicks, gradually becoming more sophisticated as demand grew. The transition from single to multi-wick frames represented a crucial step in increasing productivity. The dipping ritual was more than a mechanical task. It was a meditative practice. Makers often worked in quiet solitude or soft conversation, the steady dipping providing a rhythmic backdrop to their day. This repetitive motion fostered a deep connection between the maker and their craft, a physical embodiment of patience and care. You might smile imagining a candle maker humming softly as they dip, careful not to drip hot wax on themselves or their clothes, which were often stained and stiff with grease. The smell of melting wax, the slight sting of smoke in the eyes, and the warmth radiating from the vat created an immersive sensory environment. The dipping method also left distinctive marks on candles. The smooth layers and subtle ridges became signatures of the craft, easily distinguishable from molded or poured candles. Buyers often recognized these marks as signs of authenticity and quality. As candle makers worked through the day, the pile of finished candles grew steadily. These candles, though simple, were lifelines for homes, shops, and churches, offering the light needed for reading, cooking, worship, and socializing after sunset. Each candle bore the imprint of human hands and hours of repetitive care. Occasionally, makers faced unexpected challenges during dipping. A sudden draft could cause wax to cool unevenly, creating cracks. Impurities in the wax could lead to bubbling or weak spots, or the wick might become twisted or detached. These issues required quick fixes and constant vigilance. In festivals and busy seasons, dipping became a frantic race against time. Makers sometimes hired helpers or apprentices to speed up the process, assigning them to manage dipping frames or drying racks under close supervision. The dipping process also reflected the slow pace of medieval production before industrialization. Unlike today's mass-manufactured candles, each piece was unique, shaped by human hands and the quirks of raw materials. This personal touch lent a humble dignity to the craft, treasured by those who depended on it. You might chuckle at how much trust was placed in a simple string and wax combination to light dark medieval nights. It was a fragile hope, held in wax and flame, nurtured by steady hands and quiet persistence. So, as you watch the candlemaker dip and dry, layer by layer, imagine the rhythm of this age-old craft, the slow buildup of light from humble beginnings, a tactile meditation that turned fat and wick into the very essence of illumination. You step into a quiet evolution in candle making, the shift from simple dipping to the use of wooden and metal molds that transformed the craft into something more precise and uniform. Molding candles allowed makers to produce shapes that were consistent in size, weight, and appearance, meeting the increasing demand for candles not only as light sources but as ceremonial objects and trade goods. The molds were usually made of carved wood or thin sheets of metal like tin or lead, carefully shaped and hinged or tied to hold molten wax while it solidified. You can almost hear the clink of metal molds being opened and the soft pop of a finished candle sliding free. Its smooth surface a stark contrast to the layered texture of dip candles. The transition to molded candles wasn't sudden. It emerged gradually as makers sought ways to improve efficiency and quality. Wooden molds were common in rural workshops, often hand-carved with simple cylindrical shapes. These molds sometimes featured decorative elements, basic fluting, or simple patterns that added aesthetic appeal. Metal molds were rarer and more expensive, but allowed for finer detail and easier release. Crafting and maintaining these molds required additional skills, sometimes provided by specialist woodworkers or metalworkers collaborating with candle makers. The molding process involved melting the beeswax or tallow to a precise temperature, before pouring it into preheated molds to avoid cracking. The wax had to cool slowly to prevent bubbles and ensure structural integrity. Makers often used water baths or cool, shaded areas to regulate temperature, a delicate dance of heat and timing. Once hardened, candles were removed from the molds and trimmed to remove seams or imperfections. Molded candles offered several advantages over dipped varieties. They burned more evenly and had a smoother surface, which reduced dripping and smoke. The uniformity was especially valued by churches and wealthy patrons, where candles symbolized purity and devotion. Molded candles could also be produced faster and in larger quantities once molds were prepared, meeting growing urban demand. You might imagine the maker carefully inspecting each molded candle, checking for cracks or bubbles that could spoil the burn. Molds themselves were precious tools, requiring careful storage and repair. Wooden molds had to be kept dry to prevent warping, while metal molds were prone to rust or dents. An interesting quirk is that some molds bore makers' marks or symbols, serving as early trademarks or quality guarantees. These marks helped customers identify trusted workshops and deterred counterfeit or low-quality producers. In some regions, guilds regulated mold designs and standards, ensuring a level of consistency and craftsmanship. Historians still debate how widespread the use of molds was in medieval candle making. Some argue that molded candles were primarily the domain of wealthy urban centers and religious institutions, while rural areas continued with dipping methods due to lack of resources. Others suggest a more blended approach, with makers using molds for special orders and dipping for everyday candles. The molds also allowed for experimentation with shapes beyond the basic cylinder. Some workshops produced square or hexagonal candles, which fit together better for storage and transport. Decorative candles shaped like crosses, animals, or symbolic motifs were popular during festivals and religious ceremonies, adding layers of meaning to the simple act of illumination. The molding process was not without challenges. Air bubbles trapped in the wax could cause weak points that made candles prone to breakage. Cooling had to be carefully monitored to avoid cracks or warping, and the initial investment in molds could be prohibitive for small makers, limiting access to this method. You might smile, picturing a candle maker nervously waiting for a batch to cool, fingers crossed that the mold releases cleanly without sticking or cracking the delicate wax form. The success or failure of a single mold could mean the difference between profit and loss. The shift to molded candles marked a subtle industrialization of candle making, foreshadowing later mass production techniques. It showed the maker's constant drive to improve quality and efficiency, responding to changing markets and social demands. Beyond practicality, molded candles had symbolic importance. Their smooth, uniform surfaces embodied ideals of purity and order, essential in religious contexts. The act of molding wax into perfect forms mirrored spiritual aspirations toward perfection and transcendence. As you imagine the warm wax poured into wooden or metal molds, cooling into flawless cylinders ready to bring light to darkened halls and humble homes, you witness a moment of craft transforming simple materials into objects of beauty and function. Molded candles stand as a testament to human creativity and adaptability, bridging the gap between raw nature and refined ritual. They carried light, yes, but also culture, tradition, and the steady pulse of medieval life. You observe closely the subtle distinctions that separated a good candle from a poor one, the tiny imperfections that made all the difference between steady warmth and smoky frustration. Quality and imperfections in medieval candles were a constant concern, shaping the maker's reputation and the buyer's satisfaction. A candle that burned bright and even was a mark of skill and care, while one that sputtered, dripped, or emitted foul odors could quickly sour a customer's trust. The nature of the raw materials, the finesse of the craftsmanship, and the subtle quirks of each batch all combined to determine the final product's success. Starting with raw materials, beeswax candles were generally considered the highest quality. Their natural properties, higher melting point, clean burn, and pleasant scent made them desirable for both everyday use in wealthier households and sacred use in churches and monasteries. These candles burned longer and brighter with minimal smoke, making them worth the premium price. In contrast, tallow candles were cheaper and more accessible, but often emitted a harsh odor, produced more smoke, and burned unevenly. The type of animal fat and rendering process affected tallow quality. Sheep and cow fat tended to produce better candles than pig fat, which was usually avoided due to its unpleasant smell. Imperfections in candles often arose from the production process. Uneven layering during dipping could cause weak spots, making the candle prone to cracking or uneven burning. Air bubbles trapped in molded candles could lead to sudden flare-ups or breakage. If the wax was overheated, it could darken and become brittle, while underheating left it soft and prone to deforming. The wick's preparation was equally critical. A wick that was too thick or too thin would disrupt the flame's stability, causing flickering, smoking, or premature extinction. Imagine a candle flickering in a drafty medieval room, sputtering and dripping wax onto the rough wooden table below. The irritation it caused was more than inconvenience. Wasted wax meant wasted resources, and smoky air could irritate eyes and lungs. Buyers learned to recognize signs of poor quality, uneven color, soft texture, or strong odors, and often returned to trusted makers or guild-regulated sources for reliable candles. A quirky detail was the use of trimming knives and snuffers, specialized tools to manage candle imperfections during use. Candle snuffers were small scissors designed to trim the wick and extinguish the flame without blowing hot wax everywhere. Regular trimming was necessary to maintain a steady flame and reduce smoke. The existence of such tools highlights how users adapted to and managed the inherent imperfections of handmade candles. Historians still debate the extent to which candle quality was regulated. In urban centers, guilds imposed standards to protect consumers and uphold reputations. Makers were often required to produce candles that met minimum burn times and size specifications. Some guilds even tested candles by measuring the length of burn or weight of leftover wax. Punishments for substandard products ranged from fines to expulsion from the guild. However, in rural areas, such oversight was rare, and quality varied widely depending on the maker's skill and available materials. Another factor affecting candle quality was the environment in which they were stored and used. Excessive heat could cause candles to soften or warp, while moisture could affect wick performance. Dust and soot accumulation in workshops and homes sometimes coated candles, dulling their glow and increasing smoke. Makers and users alike had to consider these practical issues to ensure their candles served their purpose. Quality was also tied to the social role of candles. In churches, only the purest beeswax candles were acceptable, symbolizing spiritual purity and devotion. A flickering ars, smoky candle was seen as a poor offering, and might even be thought to offend the divine. This religious context heightened the importance of producing flawless candles, pushing makers to refine their techniques. Conversely, in common households, practicality often trumped perfection. A candle that burned long enough to read a prayer or finish a meal was sufficient, even if it smoked or dripped. This pragmatic attitude reflected the realities of medieval life, where scarcity and hardship shaped expectations. The market for candles reflected these quality distinctions. Wealthy buyers sought molded beeswax candles with smooth surfaces and pleasing scents. Middle-class townsfolk might buy dipped beeswax or mixed wax candles, while peasants often settled for tallow varieties. This stratification reinforced social hierarchies and shaped production patterns. Interestingly, some candle makers developed reputations based on unique imperfections such as slightly textured surfaces or particular scents that became trademarks of their craft. Buyers sought out these signature candles for their distinct qualities, creating early forms of artisanal branding. The candle's performance during use was the ultimate test of quality. A good candle burned with a steady flame, minimal smoke, and even melting, providing reliable light for hours. A poor candle sputtered, flickered, and dripped wax, wasting precious material and causing frustration. The flickering candlelight shaped medieval evenings, affecting everything from reading and socializing to safety and security. You might smile imagining medieval candle users snuffing wicks, trimming them carefully, or anxiously watching the candle burn low, hoping it would last through the night. These daily rituals intertwined with the candle's physical qualities, forming a tactile and intimate relationship with the light. As you consider the subtle imperfections and quality markers in medieval candles, you appreciate the delicate balance makers maintained between raw materials, craftsmanship, and user needs. Each candle was a fragile triumph over darkness, bearing the marks of human effort and nature's gifts. You walk through the bustling medieval marketplace, where candlemakers and peddlers gathered to display their wares, calling out softly amidst the mingling voices of merchants and townsfolk. Selling candles was as much an art as making them, a delicate dance between supply, demand, and reputation. Market stalls were often simple wooden tables, or carts piled high with rows of candles, their pale, waxen surfaces catching the sunlight and promising a flicker of light for the long nights ahead. For many makers, the market was their lifeline, a place to exchange their labor for coin, barter goods, or simply to gain favor and build relationships within the community. The act of selling candles was shaped by the nature of the product itself. Candles were bulky and fragile, prone to breaking or melting in the heat, so transportation required care. Some candle makers crafted their own portable stands or baskets lined with straw to protect their goods during long journeys. It was common for itinerant candle peddlers to travel between villages and towns, carrying their precious stock on foot or by cart, navigating rough roads and weather, all to reach new customers. Market days were often chaotic and crowded, with a cacophony of sounds shouting vendors, hawking their goods, bargaining customers, the clatter of hooves and wheels, and children weaving between stalls. Amidst this, candlemakers had to capture attention without resorting to loud shouting, relying instead on reputation, quality, and subtle displays of their products. Some arranged candles in neat rows or pyramid shapes, while others added small signs or decorations to attract buyers. You might imagine the gentle aroma of beeswax mingling with the sharper scents of tallow and added herbs, creating an invisible but compelling invitation to stop and inspect. Sellers often demonstrated their candle's quality by lighting one or two, showing a steady, clean flame and minimal smoke. This live demonstration was crucial in convincing buyers, who were wary of wasting precious coin on poor quality candles. Bartering was common, especially in rural areas where coinage was scarce. Buyers might offer food, cloth, tools, or labor in exchange for candles. This system built social bonds and networks, linking candle makers to the rhythms of village life. Sometimes, makers supplied local churches or wealthy households on credit, hoping for future payment or goods in return. Competition among candle makers could be fierce. In larger towns, multiple workshops and peddlers vied for customers, each claiming superior quality or better prices. Guilds played a role here, regulating who could sell candles, where, and at what price, to protect their members and maintain standards. Unauthorized sellers risked fines or confiscation of goods, though enforcement varied widely. Festival seasons and religious holidays created spikes in demand. Candlemakers prepared months in advance, producing bulk orders for Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days. Markets during these times were crowded and noisy, with buyers eager to stock up for celebrations that often involved lighting multiple candles in homes and churches. You can almost see the rush of buyers inspecting candle piles, negotiating prices, and loading their carts with wax and light. In some regions, candle makers formed cooperatives or partnerships to manage production and sales, sharing resources and splitting profits. These collaborations helped smaller makers survive in competitive markets and ensured a steady supply for customers. The social role of candle sellers extended beyond commerce. They were trusted members of the community, often knowing the needs of their customers intimately. They advised on candle care, recommended types for specific uses, and sometimes offered repair or trimming services. This personal connection fostered loyalty and sustained businesses through lean times. A quirky detail is that some candle makers carried small charms or tokens with their goods, believed to bring good luck and protect against theft or bad fortune. These tokens might be simple carved wooden figures, coins, or even small candles themselves, adding a layer of superstition to everyday trade. Historians still debate the scale and organization of candle markets in medieval Europe. Some argue that local markets were primarily informal gatherings, while others point to evidence of structured market halls and permanent shops specializing in candle sales. Urban centers, in particular, developed more sophisticated retail spaces with regulated stall assignments and set market days. Despite challenges, candle making and selling remained a steady source of income for many craftsmen and merchants. The importance of light in medieval life ensured a consistent, if modest, demand. Without these sellers bridging the gap between workshops and homes, the flickering glow of candles would have been a rarer and more precious commodity. Imagine the satisfaction of a candle maker at day's end, counting coins from sales, packing up leftover candles carefully, and planning the next market day. Their craft illuminated not only homes, but also the economic and social fabric of medieval communities. As you step away from the busy market scene, carrying a small bundle of candles home, you realize that every flicker of light in a medieval household began with these hardworking sellers. Their skill in both craft and commerce was essential in bringing light to darkness, one candle at a time. You step into the rhythms of the medieval calendar, where seasonal hardships shaped every aspect of candle making and use, forcing makers and users alike to adapt to the relentless cycles of nature. Winter's biting cold brought long nights demanding more light, while summer's heat threatened to spoil fragile supplies. These seasonal fluctuations dictated when candle makers worked hardest, how they stored their precious wax, and even the quality and type of candles produced. Imagine the candle maker in a dim, chilly workshop during the darkest months, racing against time and temperature to meet the soaring demand for light that extended the day beyond the sun's weak presence. Winter was simultaneously the most demanding and the most challenging season. Nights stretched into what felt like endless darkness, and families, churches, and markets all needed more candles to function. Makers worked longer hours to dip, mold, and finish candles, often in poorly heated spaces that made their labor even harder. The cold, while helping candles to harden faster, made handling tools and materials uncomfortable, numbing fingers and stiffening movements. The risk of fires increased as more candles were lit indoors, and smoke and soot filled poorly ventilated rooms, causing health hazards. Storage was a constant concern during winter. Cold temperatures hardened beeswax and tallow into brittle blocks, risking cracks and breakage during handling. Makers had to carefully insulate supplies or store them in protected areas, balancing the need to keep wax solid enough to handle, but not so cold as to become fragile. This delicate balance demanded experience and a keen eye. Conversely, summer presented its own dangers. High temperatures softened candles, causing them to warp or melt, especially if stored near hearths or in sunlit rooms. Transporting candles to markets or homes risked melting wax dripping onto carts or clothes. Makers often scheduled production around cooler parts of the day, working early mornings and late evenings to avoid heat's destructive effects. Sometimes they slowed production during the hottest months, storing enough supplies from spring to tide them over. Rain and humidity further complicated matters. Dampness could cause wicks to rot or mold, compromising candle quality. Outdoor markets on rainy days tested sellers' ingenuity in protecting their stock, using covered stalls or cloths to shield delicate candles from moisture. The seasons also influenced the types of candles produced. For instance, thicker, slower-burning beeswax candles were popular in winter for long nights, while lighter, quicker-burning tallow candles sufficed in warmer months. Makers tailored their products to meet seasonal needs and customers' budgets, balancing quality and quantity. Religious festivals and feast days punctuated the calendar, often coinciding with seasonal extremes. Candle makers faced intense pressure during these periods, fulfilling bulk orders for churches, monasteries, and households preparing for celebrations like Christmas, Easter, or All Saints' Day. These demands sometimes exceeded normal production capacity, leading to frantic nights and hurried craftsmanship. A quirky but revealing detail is that some makers timed their production cycles to the moon's phases, believing candles made under a waxing moon burned better or lasted longer. While this practice was more superstition than science, it reflects the medieval blending of craft with folklore and belief. Historians still debate how much seasonal challenges shaped candlemaking techniques and economies. Some suggest that these cycles encouraged innovations in storage, production methods, and trade networks, while others emphasize the resilience and adaptability of makers working within traditional constraints. The social impact of seasonal hardships was significant. During dark winters, households often rationed candles, using light sparingly for essential tasks. Extended evenings spent by the hearth or gathering around few candles fostered intimacy but also highlighted scarcity. In contrast, summer evenings with the longer daylight reduced candle use, easing household expenses and workload. Makers themselves adapted to seasonal rhythms. Apprentices and journeymen might be assigned lighter duties during winter due to harsher conditions, while summer allowed for training and maintenance of tools and workshops. Some regions developed seasonal fairs and markets specifically timed to coincide with candle production cycles. You can almost see the candlemaker adjusting their schedule to nature's whims, balancing heat, cold, moisture, and light needs, always striving to provide steady illumination through fluctuating seasons. Their craft was not just about wax and wick, but about mastering time and environment. The candle's glow became a symbol of resilience against the harshness of nature's cycles, a steady companion through the darkest and brightest parts of the year. Without these adaptations and the maker's enduring efforts, medieval life after sunset would have been much grimmer. So as you imagine the passing seasons influencing every step from rendering and molding to selling and burning, you appreciate the fragile interplay between human craft and natural forces that sustain light in a world without electricity. You enter the disciplined, watchful world of guild oversight, where medieval candlemakers' craftsmanship was bound tightly by rules and traditions enforced by their own communities. Guilds were more than trade associations. They were powerful institutions regulating quality, training, and commerce to protect the craft's integrity and the livelihoods of their members. In towns across Europe, candlemakers formed guilds that set strict standards on materials, production techniques, candle sizes, and even pricing. These regulations shaped the daily lives of makers, ensuring that candles met minimum expectations and that the guild's reputation remained untarnished in the eyes of customers and authorities alike. Imagine the guild hall, a dim chamber where masters and elders gathered to discuss disputes, enforce standards, and induct apprentices. Membership was a mark of prestige and security, granting access to resources, collective bargaining power, and legal protections. However, it also demanded conformity. Apprenticeships were formalized, lasting several years under a master's supervision, during which young makers learned not only technical skills but also the guild's codes of conduct and business ethics. Breaking these codes could result in fines, suspension, or expulsion, threats serious enough to keep makers aligned. The guild controlled access to raw materials, sometimes regulating who could buy or sell beeswax and tallow to prevent market flooding or inferior goods. They set weight and size standards for candles, ensuring consumers received consistent products. For example, a standard tallow candle had to burn for a certain number of hours, without excessive smoke or dripping. Guild inspectors conducted regular checks, visiting workshops unannounced to test products and production methods. These inspections were both feared and respected, enforcing discipline and quality. Violations ranged from selling underweight candles to mixing inferior fats or neglecting proper wick preparation. Punishments varied. Minor infractions might incur fines, while serious offenses, like knowingly selling fraudulent goods, could lead to public shaming or loss of guild membership. This internal policing helped maintain public trust in candles, an essential commodity with safety implications. Guilds also influenced market behavior. They fixed prices or minimum wages, controlling competition to stabilize incomes. While beneficial for members, these controls sometimes led to accusations of monopolistic behavior or inflated prices, sparking tensions with consumers and rival trades. Socially, guild membership elevated a maker's status. Masters could participate in civic affairs, own property, and marry apprentices' daughters. Guilds organized social events, religious observances, and mutual aid funds, fostering solidarity among members. This sense of community balanced the strict regulations and made the guild a central part of a maker's identity. A quirky aspect of guild life was the use of secret signs or symbols among members' handshakes, phrases, or marks on tools used to identify fellow members and exclude outsiders. These signs reinforced trust within the guild and guarded trade secrets that preserved competitive advantages. Historians still debate the extent to which guild regulations stifled innovation or preserved quality. Some argue that strict controls slowed technological advances, locking makers into traditional methods. Others contend that guild oversight protected consumers and upheld craftsmanship in an era lacking modern standards. Guilds also played a role in the religious and ceremonial aspects of candle making. They often sponsored processions, funded church repairs, or provided candles for public rituals, intertwining trade with faith and community life. This participation reinforced the moral and spiritual importance of their craft. You can imagine a guildmaster overseeing a workshop, ensuring every candle leaving the premises met exacting standards, balancing business pressures with ethical obligations. This blend of craftsmanship, commerce, and community shaped the medieval candle industry profoundly. The guild system created a framework that supported candle makers through the challenges of production, competition, and market fluctuations. It ensured that the fragile flame of quality and trust did not flicker out in the face of hardship. As you leave the guild hall and step back into the workshop, you recognize that these organizations were vital to sustaining not only the craft of candle making, but also the broader social fabric that depended on their light. You feel the weight of crown levies and church tithes pressing down on the candle makers' modest earnings, a harsh reminder that light was not only a necessity, but also a source of taxation and control. Taxes and tithes were an unavoidable burden in medieval Europe, where both secular rulers and religious authorities sought to claim a share of the candle trade's profits. These levies cut deeply into the fragile margins candle makers operated within, adding layers of complexity to their craft and commerce. Imagine a maker tallying up costs after a day's work, subtracting fees owed to lords and clergy before calculating what remained for family and workshop expenses. The crown often imposed taxes on essential goods, and candles were no exception. Some kingdoms introduced excise taxes, charging a fixed amount per candle or per batch produced. These taxes aimed to raise revenue, but also to regulate trade, control quality, and sometimes curb excessive consumption. Collectors visited workshops or marketplaces to assess inventory and enforce tax collection, making evasion risky and punishable by fines or confiscation. Church tithes added another layer of obligation. As spiritual authorities, the church claimed a tenth of many types of production, including candles, given candles' prominent role in religious rituals. Monasteries and cathedrals sometimes demanded specific amounts or qualities of wax and finished candles. These tithes could be paid in kind by delivering a portion of produced candles or in coin, depending on local agreements. For many makers, balancing these demands with daily operations was a constant juggling act. These taxes shaped the economics of candle making profoundly. To cover levies, makers often had to raise prices, pass costs to customers, or reduce material quality, sometimes leading to tension with buyers. In poor communities, high taxes could force makers to produce cheaper, lower quality candles, affecting reputation and sales. The burden of taxation also influenced market behavior. Some makers tried to hide or underreport production, while others formed partnerships or guilds to negotiate better terms or resist unfair charges. Smuggling or illicit sales occasionally emerged as desperate responses to oppressive taxation. You might chuckle imagining a candlemaker's frustration as tax collectors arrive at the workshop door, just as a fresh batch cools, eager to seize goods or cash. The tension between survival and compliance was palpable, adding stress to already demanding work. Historians still debate how these levies affected the broader candle economy. Some argue that taxes encouraged innovation and efficiency as makers sought to maximize profits despite charges. Others believe they suppressed small-scale makers, consolidating production among wealthier workshops better able to absorb cost. Church tithes, in particular, reinforced the intimate link between candle making and religious practice. Monasteries often held significant influence over local candle production, sometimes running their own apiaries and workshops. The demand for beeswax candles in religious settings was both spiritual and economic, generating substantial income for ecclesiastical institutions. The intertwining of taxation and religion created complex relationships. Candle makers sometimes depended on the church for patronage or market access, while simultaneously resenting financial demands. Negotiations and disputes over tithes were common, reflecting the balancing act between secular and spiritual powers. In some regions, Crown taxes were earmarked for specific purposes: defense, infrastructure, or royal ceremonies tying candle production indirectly to political affairs. For example, special candles were required for coronations or public events, often subject to higher levies or regulated supply. You can imagine the candlemaker carefully recording production and sales, trying to navigate the labyrinth of tax obligations while keeping the workshop afloat. Each coin lost to taxation was a small but significant blow to family livelihoods and future investment. This financial pressure influenced production decisions. Makers might prioritize cheaper tallow candles for mass sale, reserving pricier beeswax candles for elite clients who could afford taxes. Some focused on bulk production for festivals to meet higher demand and justify costs. Tax collectors themselves became familiar figures in candlemakers' lives, sometimes extending beyond mere enforcement to informal advisors or local negotiators. Relationships between makers and officials could be cordial or strained, depending on personalities and politics. Despite these challenges, candlemakers persevered. Their craft sustained households, communities, and institutions through the centuries, even as taxation gnawed at profits and complicated commerce. As you leave the shadow of levies and tithes behind, you understand that every flicker of light carried with it not just human skill, but the weight of authority and economy, illuminating the complex tapestry of medieval life. You step into the quiet sanctuaries of monasteries and cathedrals, where the demand for candles reached a sacred intensity, unmatched in any other setting. Church requirements for candles were exacting and relentless, reflecting the spiritual and practical needs of religious life. These massive stone buildings, with their long nights of prayer and vigil, required thick, slow-burning beeswax candles that could last through hours of chanting and meditation. The candlemaker's craft took on a new dimension here, not just providing light, but facilitating the rhythm of divine worship. Imagine rows of gleaming candles casting dancing shadows on ancient stone walls, their flames a visual hymn to faith and endurance. Monasteries often maintained their own apiaries, cultivating beeswax supplies for candle production. This internal control ensured a steady flow of high-quality wax, essential for religious observances. The beeswax used in churches had to meet stringent purity standards. Any admixture with tallow or impurities was strictly forbidden, as it was believed to taint the sanctity of the ritual. Makers supplying these institutions faced intense scrutiny, their candles subject to inspection and ceremonial approval. The size and thickness of church candles were remarkable. Some were enormous pillars meant to burn steadily for days, their slow consumption symbolizing eternal light. These candles were carefully crafted using molds, often decorated with religious symbols or inscriptions. Their production required specialized knowledge and significant resources, making them prestigious items that reflected the wealth and piety of the institution. Churches also demanded large quantities of candles for various liturgical purposes, processions, altars, funerals, and festivals. The sheer volume of candles consumed was staggering, necessitating efficient workshops and reliable supply chains. Makers often formed contracts with the religious institutions, guaranteeing delivery of specific amounts and qualities of candles throughout the year. The symbolism of candlelight in religious settings cannot be overstated. Flames represented divine presence, enlightenment, and the soul's journey. The act of lighting a candle was both a prayer and an offering, imbuing the physical object with profound spiritual significance. This elevated the candlemaker's role from mere craftsman to participant in sacred tradition. You might smile at the elaborate rituals surrounding candle use, from blessing the wax before crafting to the ceremonial lighting during Mass. In some cases, candles were passed through holy fire or anointed with oils, adding layers of sanctity and meaning. Such practices underscored the deep connection between candlemaking and faith. Historians still discuss how these church demands influenced broader candle production trends. The high standards and volumes required by religious institutions pushed makers to innovate and refine techniques, raising overall quality. At the same time, the exclusivity of beeswax candles in churches elevated their status and price in the general market. The economic relationship between churches and candlemakers was complex. Monasteries sometimes controlled entire supply chains, from bee cultivation to candle production and distribution. In other instances, they acted as major clients, influencing prices and standards through their purchasing power. You can envision the candlemaker meticulously crafting thick beeswax pillars destined for cathedral altars, aware that their work supported not just illumination, but centuries-old rituals. The pride and pressure of such commissions added gravitas to the craft. The cycle of candle use in religious settings followed the liturgical calendar closely. High feasts and solemnities called for special candles, often adorned with symbols like crosses or saints' names. The Easter candle, for example, was a celebrated object, blessed and carried in procession to symbolize resurrection and hope. Despite the grandeur of church candle use, the supply chain faced challenges. Bee populations fluctuated, raw material shortages occurred, and political or economic disruptions sometimes delayed deliveries. Makers had to plan carefully, stockpile materials, and maintain quality to meet deadlines and avoid disrupting sacred services. The integration of candle making into religious life shaped cultural attitudes toward light and craftsmanship. Candles were more than commodities. They were carriers of meaning, faith, and community identity. This sacred dimension inspired reverence for the maker's skill and the material itself. As you stand in the flickering glow of a cathedral filled with hundreds of candles, you sense the centuries of devotion and labor behind each flame. The candlemaker's humble craft shines in this radiant intersection of earth and heaven, light and spirit. You step carefully into the precarious world of workshop fires, where the candlemaker's livelihood and often life hung by a flickering thread. The constant presence of open flames, boiling fats, and flammable materials created an ever-present risk that could turn a humble workshop into a blazing inferno in moments. Imagine the sharp crackle of flames licking wooden beams, the acrid smoke filling narrow village alleys, and frantic neighbors rushing to douse sparks before the fire consumed everything. These fires were not just accidents. They were catastrophic events that reshaped communities, destroyed livelihoods, and reminded makers daily of the thin line between light and destruction. Workshops were often cramped and constructed from highly combustible materials, wooden frames, thatched roofs, and packed earth floors stained with wax and tallow residue. The open hearths or simple stoves used to melt fats lacked modern safety features, making accidents a grim inevitability. A dropped ladle of molten tallow, a stray ember caught in oily rags, or a flickering candle left unattended could ignite a blaze that spread rapidly through the workshop and adjoining structures. Candlemakers developed rudimentary safety practices born of necessity. They kept buckets of water or sand nearby, used metal trays to catch drips, and maintained careful attention to flame and fuel. Despite these precautions, fires were frequent, and entire workshops sometimes burned to the ground, along with precious tools and unsold candles. For many, such disasters meant financial ruin, or the need to relocate and rebuild from scratch. Firefighting methods were primitive. Villagers formed bucket brigades, passing water from wells or rivers in leather pails to douse flames. Heavy blankets or cloaks were sometimes thrown over fires to smother them. The lack of organized fire services and reliable equipment meant that once a fire gained momentum, it was often unstoppable. You might imagine the emotional toll on makers watching their life's work go up in smoke, their sweat and skill turned to ash in minutes. Some workshops were rebuilt multiple times, each fire deepening the resolve and wariness of their owners. Historians still debate the impact of workshop fires on urban planning and building regulations. In some medieval towns, devastating fires led to stricter rules requiring stone construction for workshops or prohibiting certain activities in crowded areas. These measures were early attempts to mitigate fire risks, though enforcement was inconsistent. The danger of fire extended beyond workshops to markets and homes. Candlemakers traveling to sell their goods faced risks of candles melting or igniting during transport. Households relied on proper candle care to prevent accidental fires, a daily concern in wooden, thatched buildings filled with flammable materials. The cultural memory of candle-related fires found expression in folklore and superstition. Stories of fires caused by careless candle use warned communities of the perilous nature of light and flame. Some makers and users kept charms or talismans near their work or hearths, hoping to ward off disaster. Economic consequences of fires were severe. Insurance as we know it did not exist, so losses were borne directly by individuals or families. Some candlemakers relied on guild support or charitable aid after fires, while others disappeared from records, their trade extinguished by misfortune. The interplay between light and fire embodies a deep paradox. The very element that brought light and safety could just as easily bring destruction. This tension shaped the candlemaker's identity, merging creativity with caution, hope with fear. You can almost feel the heat and see the glow of flames reflected in the maker's eyes, a a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in their craft. Every moment spent near fire was both opportunity and risk, a gamble to produce light from flame without succumbing to it. Despite these hazards, candle making persisted and evolved. Innovations in workshop design, material handling, and fire prevention gradually improved safety, though danger never disappeared entirely. The candlemakers' dance with fire remained a defining feature of their work. As you step away from the smoke and ember, you understand that every candle's gentle glow was born not only from skill, but also from courage and resilience in the face of destruction's ever-present threat. You find yourself caught in the frantic energy of festival preparations, where candlemakers shift from steady craftsmen to hurried artisans racing against the clock. Festivals and feast days were high points in medieval life, marked by communal celebrations, religious ceremonies, and nighttime vigils that required an abundance of candles. The demand surged dramatically, pushing workshops to their limits as they strove to fulfill bulk orders from churches, guilds, and households eager to light up their celebrations. Imagine the workshop buzzing with activity, apprentices dipping wicks furiously, masters molding thick beeswax pillars, and helpers packing candles into crates for delivery, all under the pressure of looming deadlines. The rhythm of festival candle production was cyclical, peaking before major events like Christmas, Easter, All Saints' Day, and local saints' feast days. These occasions called for special candles large, decorated, or scented, each imbued with symbolic significance. Makers had to plan months in advance, stockpiling raw materials and organizing labor to meet the heightened demand. Failure to supply on time risked not only financial loss, but social disgrace and damaged relationships with patrons. In these intense periods, workshops often expanded their workforce. Journeymen and apprentices worked longer hours, sometimes through the night, dipping, molding, trimming, and packaging. The physical toll was immense, hands raw from repeated dipping, eyes strained from dim light, and muscles weary from relentless motion. Yet, the festive spirit and the knowledge that their craft supported cherished traditions spurred makers onward. The bulk nature of festival orders necessitated efficient production techniques. Makers sometimes shifted to molded candles, which could be produced faster and in larger sizes, suitable for church altars or public displays. Dipped candles remained popular for smaller-scale use and household needs. The combination of methods reflected the varied demands of medieval society. Transport and delivery posed additional challenges during festival seasons. Roads crowded with travelers and merchants slowed caravans, risking delays. Weather could disrupt shipments, forcing makers to improvise or negotiate extensions. Candles had to be carefully packed to avoid damage during transit, often wrapped in straw or cloth and stacked securely. A quirky detail from these busy times was the use of temporary apprentices or day laborers, hired to assist with simple tasks like stacking candles or preparing wicks. These helpers often had little training but provided essential manpower. The bustling workshops became hive-like, filled with the sounds of chatter, clinking tools, and dripping wax. Historians still debate how these seasonal surges affected the economics of candle making. Some argue that festivals provided vital income, allowing makers to sustain operations during slower periods, while others suggest that the intense workload led to burnout and increased accidents. Guilds sometimes regulated festival production, setting quality standards and labor conditions to protect workers and consumers. The cultural importance of festival candles extended beyond illumination. They were integral to rituals symbolizing light, overcoming darkness, renewal, and divine presence. The elaborate decorations and scents added layers of meaning, making festival candles treasured objects in homes and churches alike. You can picture the pride and anxiety mingling in the candlemaker's heart as the workshop hummed with activity. Each candle crafted carried not only wax and wick, but the hopes and joy of a community preparing to celebrate together. The maker's hands were conduits of light and tradition, shaping the physical and spiritual atmosphere of the feast. After festivals, workshops often slowed, using quieter months for maintenance, training apprentices, and replenishing supplies. The cyclical nature of their work created a steady rhythm, aligning human effort with the ebb and flow of medieval life. As you step away from the clamor and candlelight of festival preparations, you carry with you an understanding of how this humble craft connected people, faith, and celebration, illuminating not just rooms, but hearts and traditions. You step into the realm of innovation, where candle makers experimented with hollow candle molds to create sturdier, longer burning lights that transformed illumination in medieval homes and churches. This early development was a significant departure from solid dipped or molded candles, introducing a hollow core that saved materials and improved burning efficiency. Imagine a candle slowly consuming its wax from the outside in, its hollow center allowing air to circulate and the flame to last longer without melting away the entire candle at once. This technique was both ingenious and practical, representing the maker's response to economic pressures and customer demands for better products. The creation of hollow candles required new molds, often two-part wooden or metal form shaped to encase a central rod or core, which was removed after the wax hardened, leaving a void inside. This void reduced the amount of beeswax or tallow needed per candle, lowering production costs while maintaining size and appearance. Hollow candles also burned more evenly and were less prone to dripping, enhancing user experience. Crafting these candles demanded precision. The wax had to be poured carefully around the core to avoid air pockets, and cooling had to be controlled to prevent cracks or deformities. Makers developed techniques to polish and finish the exterior surfaces, ensuring the candles retained an attractive and functional form. The innovation of hollow candles met with mixed reactions initially. Some buyers questioned their durability or performance, while others embraced the improved burning times and cost-effectiveness. Over time, hollow candles gained popularity, especially in urban centers where cost and quality considerations were paramount. A quirky but fascinating detail is that some hollow candles were scented or colored by layering different waxes during molding, creating subtle visual and olfactory effects. These multi-layered candles were prized as luxury items and gifts, showcasing the candlemaker's skill and creativity. Historians still discuss the extent and spread of hollow candle technology. Some evidence points to its origins in Mediterranean regions, spreading slowly northward through trade and artisan networks. The technique represented a step toward mechanization and efficiency that foreshadowed later industrial advances. The adoption of hollow molds also influenced candle consumption patterns. Longer burning candles allowed households to ration light more effectively, reducing waste and expense. This efficiency was especially valuable in poorer communities, where every scrap of wax mattered. In religious settings, hollow candles found uses in processions and ceremonies requiring long-lasting light without frequent replacement. The symbolic association of light enduring through darkness resonated deeply in spiritual contexts. You can imagine the workshop adapting to this new method, with makers learning new mold-making skills, adjusting heating and cooling practices, and training apprentices in the delicate handling of hollow forms. This period was one of learning and adaptation, balancing tradition with innovation. The hollow candle innovation also created economic ripple effects. Lower material costs enabled makers to expand markets, offering more affordable candles to a broader customer base. Competition increased, driving further improvements and diversification in candle products. Socially, these advances empowered smaller workshops and independent makers, who could now produce competitive candles without large material investments. The democratization of light followed these technical leaps, gradually illuminating more homes and lives. You might smile picturing a candle maker carefully removing a cooled hollow candle from its mold, marveling at the balance of form and function. This blend of craft and invention symbolized the resilience and creativity inherent in medieval trades. As you leave the world of hollow candles, you carry with you a sense of progress, how human ingenuity found ways to stretch resources, improve quality, and brighten the long nights of history, one hollow wick at a time. You step softly into the mysterious world of folklore and superstition that wove itself tightly around the craft of candle making, where every flicker of flame was believed to carry deeper meanings and powers beyond mere illumination. In medieval communities, candles were not simply tools, they were vessels of magic, protection, and ritual significance. Makers and users alike imbued candles with charms and symbols, blending practical craft with spiritual and mystical beliefs. Imagine a candle adorned with dried flowers, herbs, or secret inscriptions, flickering in a shadowed room. Its light, a guardian against unseen forces, and a beacon of hope amid uncertainty. One of the most common superstitions involved embedding lucky dried flowers or herbs within candles during the molding or dipping process. Rosemary, lavender, and rue were favored for their reputed protective qualities. believed to ward off evil spirits, illnesses, and bad luck. A candle containing these botanical charms was more than light. It was a talisman. Some families kept such candles burning continuously during times of illness or distress, hoping to channel their protective power. The belief in candle magic extended to the timing of candle making. Certain days, hours, or moon phases were thought to enhance the candle's potency. For example, candles made during a waxing moon were said to bring growth and prosperity, while those crafted under a waning moon might ward off misfortune. These practices reflected the medieval worldview, where nature's rhythms influenced human fate. In some regions, makers inscribed symbols or prayers on candles, particularly those intended for religious or protective use. Crosses, saints' names, or mystical signs were carved or painted onto the candle's surface, transforming it into a sacred object. Burning such candles was believed to invoke divine favor or dispel malevolent influences. A curious and less documented practice involved the use of animal parts such as feathers, bones, or even hair hidden inside candles as charms. While modern sensibilities recoil at this, such beliefs were part of a rich tapestry of folk magic blending natural and supernatural elements. These candles were often reserved for special occasions or rituals, not everyday use. Historians still debate the extent to which these superstitions influenced mainstream candle making versus being confined to folk practices. Some evidence suggests that guilds and church authorities discouraged or condemned certain magical practices, while others tolerated or incorporated them into sanctioned rituals. The line between accepted religious symbolism and forbidden magic was often blurred. The ritual use of candles in life, events, births, weddings, funerals carried its own set of beliefs and customs. Lighting a candle at a birth was thought to protect the newborn, while wedding candles symbolized unity and blessing. Funeral candles served as guides for the departed soul, lighting the path to the afterlife. These customs reinforced the candle's role as a mediator between the physical and spiritual worlds. You can imagine the quiet reverence with which families handled these enchanted candles, the soft glow casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with unseen spirits. The candlemaker's hands were thus not only shaping wax, but crafting hope, faith, and protection. The communal sharing of candle magic stories and practices created bonds among villagers, weaving a shared cultural fabric where light and belief intertwined. Festivals and holy days often included candle-related rituals that combined public celebration with private devotion. The practical and mystical aspects of candle making were inseparable in medieval life. The flame was both a source of warmth and a symbol of human resilience against darkness, chaos, and fear. This duality shaped the craft's evolution and its place in society. You might smile at the rich tapestry of beliefs surrounding candles, recognizing that even the most humble objects can carry profound meaning. The wax and wick were the physical forms of hopes, fears, and traditions handed down through generations. As you leave the world of candle folklore, you carry with you a deeper appreciation for how light in medieval times was never just practical, it was magical, sacred, and deeply human. You step into the competitive arena of illumination alternatives, where candles faced rival light sources such as rushlights and oil lamps, each vying for a place in medieval households. While candles were prized for their steady glow and symbolic resonance, alternatives offered practical or economic advantages, shaping the choices of those seeking to light their homes. Imagine a rustic kitchen lit by the flickering flame of a rushlight, a dried rush dipped in tallow casting a dance of shadows on rough walls, or an oil lamp burning a small pool of rendered fat or vegetable oil, its flame smaller but lasting longer. These alternatives shaped the patchwork of medieval illumination, offering different balances of cost, convenience, and quality. Rushlights were among the simplest and cheapest forms of artificial light. Made by soaking rush stalks in animal fat or grease, they burned with a weak, sputtering flame, but required minimal materials and skill to produce. For the poorest households, rushlights were often the only affordable light source, used for brief tasks or emergencies. Their flickering light was less reliable than candles, and the smoke and smell were unpleasant, but their accessibility made them indispensable. Oil lamps, on the other hand, burned various fuels, animal fats, fish oils, or vegetable oils such as olive or walnut oil held in simple clay or metal vessels. These lamps provided steady, controlled flames, were relatively easy to maintain, and could burn for extended periods. However, oil was often costly or scarce, limiting widespread use. Some lamps featured wicks made from woven fibers, and designs varied from open bowls to enclosed lanterns. The lamp's portability and lower risk of dripping made them practical for many settings. Candles, especially beeswax candles, were considered superior in quality, providing brighter, cleaner, and more reliable light. Their symbolic and religious importance also elevated their status. However, the higher cost of beeswax and the labor-intensive production made candles a luxury for many, reinforcing the market niche for rushlights and oil lamps. Historians still debate the extent of competition among these light sources and their regional variations. In some areas, oil lamps dominated due to abundant olive oil, while in colder regions, tallow-based candles and rushlights prevailed. Economic status, geography, and cultural preferences all influenced illumination choices. The coexistence of these technologies created a layered lighting landscape in medieval society. Wealthier homes might have multiple candles for rooms and rituals, supplemented by oil lamps for specific tasks, while poorer households relied heavily on rushlights or makeshift torches. Social implications of these choices were significant. The quality and quantity of light reflected not just practical needs but social standing and religious observance. Access to superior lighting symbolized prosperity and spiritual favor, while poor light sources underscored hardship. You might chuckle imagining a medieval family juggling these light sources, lighting a beeswax candle for the evening meal, using a rushlight for a late chore, and an oil lamp in the workshop. This patchwork solution exemplified resourcefulness amid constraints. The maintenance of these alternatives varied. Rushlights required frequent replacement and careful handling. Oil lamps demanded clean fuel and wick trimming. Candles offered convenience, but at higher cost and preparation time. Competition among light sources also spurred innovation. Candlemakers improved techniques and quality to compete. While oil lamp designs evolved for efficiency and safety, market dynamics encouraged diversity rather than a single dominant solution. You can imagine marketplaces offering all these products side by side, each vendor appealing to different customer needs and budgets. The choice of illumination was as much about economics and practicality as about light itself. This rich diversity of lighting methods illustrates medieval life's complexity, where survival, belief, and culture intertwined in everyday decisions. As you step away from flickering candles and glowing oil lamps, you appreciate the human ingenuity that turned simple materials into light, adapting to the world's challenges with creativity and persistence. You arrive at the final glow of candlemaking's long history, where the humble craft began to wane under the pressure of new technologies and changing times. The evolution of candlemaking, once a vital trade illuminating homes, churches, and streets, gradually gave way to innovations like gas lighting and, eventually, electricity, transforming the very nature of how humans banish darkness. Imagine a quiet workshop fading into memory as flickering candles became relics, replaced by brighter, safer, and more convenient sources of light. This final chapter reflects not only the end of an era, but the enduring legacy of a craft that shaped human experience for centuries. The decline of candlemaking began subtly in the 17th century with the rise of oil lamps fueled by whale oil, and later kerosene, offering longer burn times and brighter flames. Urban centers, in particular, embraced these alternatives for street lighting and indoor use. The Industrial Revolution accelerated changes, introducing mechanized production of candles that reduced costs but altered traditional craftsmanship. Mass-produced candles flooded markets, often made from cheaper paraffin wax, diluting the artisanal quality once prized. Electricity's arrival in the 19th and 20th centuries was the final transformative blow. Electric lighting offered instant, controllable, and virtually unlimited illumination, rendering candles largely decorative or symbolic. Public and private spaces rapidly adapted to the new technology, relegating candles to ambiance and ritual. The candlemaker's role shifted dramatically from essential tradesperson to niche artisan. Despite this decline, candlemaking never disappeared entirely. Artisans and hobbyists preserved traditional techniques, crafting beeswax candles for religious ceremonies, historical reenactments, and luxury markets. The symbolic and aesthetic value of candles endured, connecting modern users to a long heritage of light and meaning. The fading of candlemaking also reflected broader social and economic shifts, urbanization, industrialization, and changes in energy sources reshaped communities and economies, altering demand and production patterns. Small workshops closed or adapted, while large factories dominated supply chains. Historians reflect on candlemaking as a window into human resilience, creativity, and the desire to conquer darkness. The craft's evolution mirrors technological progress and cultural transformations, highlighting the interplay between necessity and innovation. You might smile imagining the final batches of handcrafted candles, made with care and tradition, passing quietly into history as electric bulbs lit new paths. These candles carried centuries of light, warmth, and human endeavor, their flickering flames a testament to the enduring human spirit. As you look back on the candlemaker's journey from wild beeswax hunts to guild halls, from festive rushes to technological sunset, you recognize a story of adaptation, struggle, and the relentless pursuit of illumination. The final glow of candlemaking reminds us that even the simplest crafts hold deep significance, illuminating not just rooms, but the human story itself.